March 1945. Somewhere along the Rhine River in Germany, a young Canadian soldier stood in the middle of a muddy farmyard, with his hands raised high above his head. German paratroopers surrounded him on all sides, their rifles pointed directly at his chest. At least 20 of them, maybe more. Their faces showed confusion because this Canadian was not trembling with fear like most captured soldiers. He was not crying. He was not begging for mercy. Instead, something strange was happening. His lips curled into a small smile. Then a quiet chuckle escaped his throat. The Germans looked at each other, completely unsure what to make of this laughing prisoner. They had no idea that in less than 30 seconds, 42 of them would be lying dead on the frozen ground. This is the true story of how one captured Canadian soldier turned his own surrender into one of the most devastating counterattacks of the entire Rhine campaign. Yes, you read that title correctly. 42 Germans dead. 24 seconds. One laughing Canadian who refused to accept defeat even when surrounded and apparently beaten. How does a single man, apparently disarmed and defeated, kill 42 enemy soldiers in less than half a minute? And why do the Germans who survived still call him the Laughing Devil nearly 80 years later? By March 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its final bloody chapter. The Allies had pushed deep into Germany itself. The Rhine River, Germany's last great natural barrier, had been breached in multiple places. Canadian First Army was fighting alongside British forces in a massive operation called Operation Plunder. Their mission was simple but deadly. Cross the Rhine, smash through the final German defenses, end the war. Victory seemed certain now. Everyone knew Germany was losing. But knowing you are losing does not mean you stop fighting. Every single mile the Canadians advanced came at a terrible cost. The Germans were not running away. They were dug in deep, desperate, fighting like cornered animals with nothing left to lose. Every farmhouse could hide a machine gun nest. Every tree line could conceal a mortar team. Every peaceful-looking village could become a death trap in seconds. The German soldiers knew their homeland was being invaded. Many of them had families just a few miles away. Wives, children, parents. They fought with the fury of men protecting everything they loved, even though their cause was already lost. The numbers tell the brutal story of how savage this fighting really was. In just the first week of the Rhine crossings, Allied forces suffered over 3,500 casualties. That is 3,500 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 7 days. The Germans, even though they were vastly outnumbered and running dangerously low on ammunition and supplies, were still inflicting losses at an almost equal rate in some sectors. This was not the easy victory march some soldiers had hoped for. This was vicious close-quarters combat, where death could come from anywhere at any moment. The fighting around the Rhine was not like the big tank battles you see in movies. It was small groups of exhausted men clearing buildings room by room. It was patrols stumbling into deadly ambushes in foggy fields at dawn. It was sudden bursts of machine gun fire from hidden positions that cut men down before they could even react. It was grenades thrown through windows. It was hand-to-hand, fighting in basements and barns with knives and rifle butts. Both sides were exhausted beyond measure, scared beyond reason, and running on nothing but adrenaline and pure desperation to survive another hour. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody had ever heard of. His name was Private Thomas Higgins. Everyone in his unit called him Tommy. He was 24 years old and came from a small farming town in Saskatchewan, a flat prairie province in western Canada, where winter winds could freeze your breath in your lungs before it left your mouth. Tommy had grown up working his family's wheat farm. He woke before sunrise every single day to do back-breaking chores. He learned the value of hard work and persistence from the moment he could walk. Life on the Canadian prairie taught you one crucial lesson. You keep going even when things get impossibly tough. That lesson would save his life more than once during the war. Tommy had joined the Canadian Army in 1942. He was not part of that first eager wave of volunteers who rushed to enlist in 1939 and 1940 when the war seemed like a great adventure. By 1942, everyone knew exactly what war really meant. The disaster at Dieppe in August 1942 had killed or captured thousands of Canadian soldiers in a single disastrous day. Tommy knew the risks when he signed his name on that enlistment paper. He went anyway because he felt it was his duty. And because his two older brothers had already enlisted, he simply could not stay home safe while they fought and bled overseas. After basic training, Tommy was assigned to the Regina Rifles Regiment, part of the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade. He arrived in England in early 1943 and spent over a year training relentlessly for the invasion of France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day itself, Tommy waded ashore at Juno Beach in Normandy with his rifle held high over his head to keep it dry. He was absolutely terrified, but kept moving forward because the men beside him were moving forward. That is how you survive combat. You focus on the next step, the next task, the next moment. You do not think about tomorrow because tomorrow might never come. Tommy survived the brutal fighting in Normandy, where entire forests were turned into splinters by artillery fire. He survived the Battle of the Scheldt in Belgium during the fall of 1944, fighting in flooded fields and freezing rain for weeks on end. He survived the frozen hell of the Rhineland winter campaign, where frostbite killed just as many men as enemy bullets. By March 1945, Tommy was a veteran. He had seen things no human being should ever have to see. He knew how to move under fire without panicking. He knew how to stay calm when everything around him was absolute chaos. Most importantly, he knew how to survive when survival seemed impossible. His fellow soldiers noticed something unusual about Tommy, something that set him apart from every other man in the regiment. While other soldiers cursed during artillery bombardments or prayed desperately during firefights, Tommy told jokes. Dark jokes, often about death itself. It was his way of dealing with the constant fear that gnawed at every soldier's guts. Some men thought he was completely crazy. Others found that his humor actually helped them stay calm too. His sergeant once said that Tommy's laugh was worth more than any medal because it reminded everyone that they were still human, still alive, still capable of finding something funny even in the middle of hell on earth. Tommy carried the standard British Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle that all Canadian infantry used. It was a reliable weapon, accurate up to 600 yards, capable of firing 10 rounds before needing to be reloaded. But in close combat, the rifle was not always the most useful weapon. That is why Tommy, like all infantry soldiers, also carried grenades. The standard grenade was called the Mills bomb. It was about the size and weight of a baseball, and filled with explosive and metal fragments designed to tear through human flesh. When it detonated, it could kill or wound anyone within 10 yards. Most soldiers carried 2 grenades as standard equipment. Tommy carried 8. He clipped them everywhere on his webbing, the canvas straps and pouches that held all his equipment. His platoon sergeant joked that Tommy clinked when he walked because of all the grenades hanging off him like deadly Christmas ornaments. Tommy did not care about the extra weight. He had seen too many situations where having one more grenade meant the difference between living and dying. Better to carry the extra weight than to run out of grenades when you needed them most. On that particular cold March morning, Tommy's section had received orders to clear a series of farmhouses near the Rhine River. Intelligence reports suggested there would be minimal resistance. Most German forces had supposedly pulled back across the river to establish new defensive lines on the far side. The farmhouses were expected to be empty, or held by just a few frightened stragglers ready to surrender. Intelligence was dead wrong. A full company of German paratroopers called Fallschirmjäger had set up elaborate defensive positions in these buildings. These were not ordinary German soldiers. They were elite troops. Veterans who had fought from North Africa to Normandy to the Rhine without breaking. They were outnumbered, outgunned, running desperately low on ammunition and supplies. But they were determined to delay the Allied advance for as long as humanly possible. They had turned these innocent-looking farmhouses into a death trap. And Tommy's section was walking straight into it. The morning was cold and damp, typical weather for the Rhineland in early spring. Thick fog hung low over the fields like a gray burial shroud, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards. You could not see far enough to spot danger until you were right on top of it. Tommy's section moved slowly toward the first farmhouse, weapons ready, every man's eyes scanning the windows and doorways for any sign of movement. Their boots squelched in the muddy ground with each careful step. An eerie silence hung over everything. No birds singing, no sounds of farm animals, just the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of your neck stand straight up. They were perhaps 50 meters from the farmhouse when the world exploded into violence. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. Muzzle flashes sparked from windows from the barn, from defensive positions hidden behind farm equipment that they had not even noticed. The distinctive rapid hammering of German MG-42 machine guns filled the air. Those guns could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blended into one continuous tearing sound, like God himself was ripping the fabric of reality apart. 4 Canadians went down immediately, hit before they could even react. The rest of the section dove for whatever cover they could find. Some made it to a low stone wall. Others rolled into a shallow ditch. A few found shell craters from earlier fighting and pressed themselves into the frozen mud, praying the earth would swallow them whole. In the chaos and confusion of the ambush, Tommy became completely separated from the rest of his section. He had rolled into a small depression in the ground, a natural dip that gave him just enough cover to avoid being hit by the storm of bullets tearing the air apart above his head. When he looked back toward his comrades, they were pinned down 30 meters behind him. The German machine guns had them completely suppressed. Anyone who raised their head got shot at immediately. They could not move forward. They could not retreat. They were stuck in a killing ground. Tommy realized his situation was even worse. He was utterly alone, directly between the German positions and his own men. If he stayed where he was, the Germans would eventually throw grenades at him, or send soldiers to flank around and kill him from the side. If he tried to crawl back to his section, he would have to cross 30 meters of open ground with multiple German machine guns trained on that exact area. That was suicide. No one could cross that much open ground and survive. That left only one option. Go forward, attack alone, against over 40 German soldiers in prepared defensive positions. Most men would have frozen in absolute terror at this point. Most men would have waited and hoped for a miracle that would never come. But Tommy had an insane idea forming in his head, and that idea required the Germans to think he had given up completely. He needed them to believe he was beaten, finished, no longer a threat. He stood up slowly, his hands rising above his head, his rifle left on the ground. That same strange chuckle escaped his throat as he shook his head like he could not believe his own terrible luck. The German machine guns stopped firing. Confused voices shouted in German. Tommy kept his hands high, kept that eerie smile on his face, and waited to see if they would take the bait. A young German lieutenant emerged from the farmhouse doorway, pistol drawn, shouting commands in German. Other German soldiers appeared from their positions all around the farmyard. Rifles and submachine guns pointed at Tommy from every direction. They surrounded him cautiously, still not entirely trusting this laughing Canadian. Tommy counted them quickly. His eyes flickered from face to face, position to position. 42 visible Germans, all clustered within 15 meters of where he stood, all grouped together in a tight formation. Perfect. The lieutenant barked something in broken English about surrender. Tommy nodded, still wearing that strange, unsettling smile. German hands patted him down roughly, searching for weapons. They found his knife and pulled it from its sheath. They found spare ammunition magazines and tossed them aside carelessly. They checked his pockets and found nothing dangerous. But in their eagerness to process this bizarre prisoner who would not stop chuckling, they made one fatal mistake. They did not check carefully under his jacket. They did not find the 8 grenades still clipped to his webbing, hidden beneath the thick folds of his uniform. The Germans relaxed visibly. The tension drained from their faces as their weapons lowered. They had captured an enemy soldier without losing anyone. But everything they thought they knew was about to change. In the next 24 seconds, Tommy Higgins would transform from a helpless prisoner into the deadliest force these German paratroopers had ever faced. 42 of them would fall before anyone could even understand what was happening. The Laughing Devil was about to earn his name. In Part 2, we will witness the most devastating 24 seconds of the entire Rhine campaign. We will see exactly how one man with 8 grenades turned a certain defeat into an impossible victory. We will hear the testimony of the German survivors who watched their entire unit get destroyed by a single laughing Canadian. And we will learn why the German High Command issued specific warnings about Canadian soldiers after this incident. The question is not whether Tommy will survive. The question is how many Germans will be left standing when those 24 seconds are over. The answer will shock you. In Part 1, we met Private Thomas Higgins, a Saskatchewan farm boy turned battle-hardened veteran of the Regina Rifles Regiment. We watched as he walked into a German ambush near the Rhine River in March 1945. We saw him make the insane decision to fake his own surrender, standing up with his hands raised, while 42 German paratroopers surrounded him with rifles pointed at his chest. We left him standing in that muddy farmyard, still smiling that eerie smile, while the Germans searched him for weapons. They found his knife. They found his ammunition. But they missed the 8 grenades hidden beneath his jacket. Now the trap was set. 42 elite German soldiers stood clustered together, completely convinced they had captured a helpless prisoner. They had no idea they were standing in a kill zone. They had no idea that in the next 24 seconds, every single one of them would either be dead or dying. This is the moment everything changed. This is the moment Tommy Higgins became the Laughing Devil. The German lieutenant was still barking orders in broken English. Something about prisoner processing. Something about interrogation. Tommy was not listening to a single word. His mind was calculating distances, angles, timing. 42 Germans visible. Most of them clustered in 3 main groups. The largest group stood near the farmhouse door, maybe 15 men gathered around the lieutenant. The second group was near the barn, about 12 soldiers who had been manning the machine gun positions. The third group was scattered around the farmyard perimeter. Another 15 men who had come out of their hiding spots to see the captured Canadian. All of them were within 15 meters of where Tommy stood. All of them had lowered their weapons. All of them were dead men who did not know it yet. Tommy took one deep breath. The smile vanished from his face like a mask being ripped away. His hands dropped from above his head. His fingers found the pins of 2 grenades simultaneously. The nearest German started to raise his rifle. His brain had finally registered that something was wrong. But his body was too slow. Far too slow. Pins pulled. 1 grenade in each hand. Tommy's arm was already moving before the metal clinked against the frozen ground. The first grenade flew toward the lieutenant, and the 15 men clustered near the farmhouse door. The throw was perfect. Practiced through hundreds of training drills and 9 months of brutal combat experience. The grenade landed right at their feet. Before it even hit the ground, Tommy's other hand was already releasing the second grenade toward the machine gun crew near the barn. His fingers were already reaching for a third grenade clipped to his webbing. The first grenade detonated with a massive blast that echoed across the fields like thunder. The lieutenant and at least 8 men around him collapsed instantly. Shrapnel tore through flesh and bone. The blast knocked others off their feet like rag dolls thrown by an angry child. Screaming began. Confusion turned to pure animal panic. Half a second later, the second grenade exploded inside the cluster of men near the barn. The machine gun crew that had pinned down Tommy's section was simply erased from existence. Flames and smoke poured from their position. Bodies flew through the air. Men who had been standing upright one moment were lying in pieces the next. Tommy was not watching. Tommy was moving. Third grenade out. Pin pulled with his teeth. The pain shot through his jaw, but he did not care. He hurled it at a group of Germans who were desperately trying to bring their weapons to bear on him. Their hands were shaking with shock and fear. Their movements were clumsy and uncoordinated. They had gone from relaxed confidence to absolute terror in less than 2 seconds. Their brains could not process what was happening fast enough. The third explosion caught 6 more Germans in the open. They went down like puppets with their strings cut. Blood sprayed across the muddy ground. Fourth grenade already in Tommy's hand. Pin already pulled. He threw it at the remaining group, trying to organize some kind of defense behind a wooden farm cart. They thought the cart would protect them. They were wrong. The explosion caught 5 Germans who had clustered together behind the flimsy cover. The farm cart disintegrated into flying splinters and metal fragments that became secondary shrapnel. Men screamed as wood and metal tore through their bodies. 5th grenade, 6th grenade, 7th grenade. Tommy was a machine now. Pull, throw, pull, throw. Each explosion adding to the chaos. Each blast killing more Germans before they could even understand what was happening. The farmyard had become a hellscape of smoke and fire and screaming men. Bodies lay everywhere in twisted heaps. The 8th and final grenade flew toward the last pocket of resistance. 4 Germans had managed to take cover behind a stone water trough. They were the only ones still capable of fighting back. One of them had actually managed to raise his rifle and was taking aim at Tommy. The grenade landed behind them. The explosion lifted all 4 men off their feet and threw them forward over the trough. They landed in broken heaps and did not move again. Silence. 8 grenades thrown in 12 seconds. Tommy's hands were empty now. Smoke and dust filled the air so thick he could barely see. His ears rang from the blasts. The chemical smell of explosives mixed with the copper smell of blood created a stench that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. But it was not over. Through the smoke, Tommy could see movement. Survivors. Germans who had been on the edges of the blast zones. Wounded, but still alive. Still potentially dangerous. Tommy scrambled forward through the carnage and grabbed a fallen German rifle. A Kar 98K bolt-action rifle. He brought it smoothly to his shoulder with the practiced ease of a man who had been shooting since childhood on the Saskatchewan prairie. 2 Germans were stumbling to their feet, bleeding heavily, but still trying to raise their weapons. Tommy fired twice. Both men fell and did not rise again. Another German emerged from behind a pile of debris. Tommy worked the bolt and fired again. The man spun and collapsed. Movement to his left. A German crawling toward a discarded submachine gun. Tommy pivoted and fired. The crawling stopped. 12 seconds of grenades. 12 more seconds of rifle fire. 24 seconds total. 42 German soldiers lay dead or dying around him. Tommy stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his chest heaving, sweat and blood mixed on his face. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. He checked the rifle in his hands to make sure it still had ammunition. 3 rounds left. He reached down and grabbed another rifle from a fallen German, then another. He slung them over his shoulder. If any more Germans came, he would be ready. Behind him, he could hear shouts in English. His section was finally advancing. They were breaking from cover and rushing forward now that the German guns had gone completely silent. They reached Tommy's position and stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the scene in complete disbelief. Bodies everywhere. Grenade craters still smoking. Blood pooling in the mud. Shell casings scattered across the ground. And Tommy standing in the middle of it all. Alive. Untouched. Like some kind of demon summoned from the depths of hell itself. His sergeant, a tough man named William Fraser, who had seen 3 years of continuous combat across 2 continents, looked around slowly. His mouth hung open. His eyes moved from body to body, counting silently. Finally, he found his voice. The exact words he spoke would be remembered and repeated for decades afterward in every Canadian military bar and reunion hall. "What the bloody hell did you do, Higgins?" It was not really a question. It was an expression of pure disbelief from a man who thought he had seen everything war had to offer. Tommy bent down and picked up his own Lee Enfield rifle from where he had dropped it before his fake surrender. He checked the chamber to make sure it was still loaded. Then he looked at his sergeant with an expression that showed absolutely no emotion. "They did not search me properly, Sarge." That was all he said. As if killing 42 enemy soldiers in 24 seconds was just another day at the office. As if what he had just done was the most normal thing in the world. The other soldiers in the section exchanged glances. They had known Tommy for months. They had fought beside him through Normandy and Belgium and the Rhineland. They thought they knew what kind of man he was. Now they realized they had not known him at all. Now they realized that beneath that joking exterior lived something else entirely. Something dangerous. The section moved quickly to clear the remaining farm buildings, adrenaline still pumping through their veins. Every shadow could hide another enemy. Every doorway could be a death trap. They kicked in doors and swept rooms with rifles raised. In the main farmhouse, they found 5 more German soldiers hiding in the cellar. These men had heard everything. The explosions, the screaming, the terrible silence that followed. When they saw the Canadians descending the stairs, they surrendered immediately, without the slightest resistance. Their hands shook violently as they raised them above their heads. Their faces showed pure terror. They had listened to 42 of their comrades die in less than half a minute. They wanted no part of whatever demon had done that. The Canadian medic checked Tommy thoroughly for wounds after the buildings were secured. Besides minor cuts and scratches from grenade fragments and flying debris, he was completely unharmed. The medic could not believe it. 8 grenade explosions at close range. Dozens of enemy soldiers firing wildly in his direction. A 24-second rampage through the middle of a fortified position. And Tommy had walked away with nothing but a few scratches. The medic shook his head and muttered something about divine intervention. Either God was protecting this man, or the devil himself wanted him alive for some reason. The 42 German casualties were confirmed and counted over the next hour. 37 had been killed instantly or died within minutes from their wounds. 5 more were mortally wounded and would not survive to see sunset. Among the dead was the young lieutenant who had emerged from the farmhouse to accept Tommy's surrender. His name was Wilhelm Hartmann. He was 23 years old. He had a wife named Greta waiting for him back in Bavaria. She was pregnant with their first child, a daughter he would never meet. Also dead were 3 veteran sergeants who had fought since the German invasion of Crete back in 1941. These were experienced soldiers, survivors of years of brutal combat across 3 continents, men who had killed dozens of Allied soldiers. They had all died in less than half a minute because they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated a smiling Canadian with grenades hidden under his jacket. Word spread through the Canadian regiment within hours. Soldiers found excuses to pass by the farmhouse. They wanted to see the evidence with their own eyes. Grenade fragments embedded in walls, bodies lying in distinct clusters matching the blast patterns, scorch marks that told the story without needing any words. Men stood in silence, staring at the carnage, trying to imagine what those 24 seconds must have been like, trying to understand how one man could do so much damage so quickly. Tommy's company commander arrived to inspect the scene personally that afternoon. Captain James Morrison walked around carefully, examining everything, asking questions, taking detailed notes. Then he pulled Tommy aside and told him something that should have made any soldier proud. He said he was recommending Tommy for the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the entire British Empire. The citation would describe exceptional gallantry and resourcefulness in the face of overwhelming odds. Tommy just nodded quietly. He did not seem excited. He did not seem proud. He seemed tired, like a man who had just done something terrible and was only beginning to understand what it meant. One of the 5 German survivors was a young soldier named Hans Müller, only 19 years old. He had been badly wounded by grenade shrapnel and would eventually lose his left arm. When he was interrogated later through an interpreter, he described Tommy with a phrase that would become legend: Der lachende Teufel, the laughing devil. He told the interrogator something that perfectly captured the horror of those 24 seconds. We thought he was surrendering. We thought he was insane. We were wrong about both things. He was never surrendering, and he was not insane. We were insane for not taking him seriously. But the story of the Laughing Devil was far from over. Word of what Tommy had done did not just spread through the Canadian forces. It spread to German intelligence as well. Within days, reports about the farmhouse massacre reached German high command. Officers analyzed what had happened and drew disturbing conclusions. If one Canadian could cause this much damage, what did that mean for the rest of the war? How many other Laughing Devils were out there waiting to strike? The German High Command made a decision that would have consequences far beyond this single incident. They issued new orders to all units facing Canadian forces. Orders that would change how Germans treated Canadian prisoners for the rest of the war. And not in a good way. In Part 3, we will see the terrifying aftermath of Tommy's actions. We will learn how German commanders responded to the Laughing Devil incident with brutal new policies. We will discover what happened when Tommy faced the consequences of his own legend. And we will witness the final chapter of his war, a chapter that includes liberation horror and a secret he would carry to his grave. The 24 seconds were over, but the real battle was just beginning. In Part 1, we met Private Thomas Higgins, a Saskatchewan farm boy who walked straight into a German ambush near the Rhine River. We watched him make the insane decision to fake his own surrender while hiding 8 grenades under his jacket. In Part 2, we witnessed the most devastating 24 seconds of the entire Rhine campaign. Tommy pulled those grenades one by one and turned a muddy farmyard into a killing field. 42 elite German paratroopers fell before anyone could even understand what was happening. The Laughing Devil had earned his name in blood and fire. But killing 42 men in 24 seconds does not happen in a vacuum. Word spreads, stories travel, and when German intelligence learned what happened at that farmhouse, they did not just take notes, they took action. Within 72 hours, new orders were issued to every German unit facing Canadian forces. Orders that would have consequences far beyond what anyone expected. The legend of the Laughing Devil was about to become a weapon itself, and not everyone would survive what came next. German military intelligence operated with brutal efficiency even in the final months of the war. Field reports from the Rhine sector reached divisional headquarters within hours of any significant engagement. The report about the farmhouse massacre arrived on the desk of Colonel Heinrich Vogel on March 17, 1945. Vogel was a veteran intelligence officer who had served since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He had read thousands of after-action reports. He had seen every kind of Allied tactic imaginable. But this report made him stop and read it 3 times. 42 casualties. 1 enemy soldier. 24 seconds. The mathematics simply did not make sense. Vogel immediately ordered a detailed investigation. Survivors were interrogated. The farmhouse site was examined by German engineers before Canadian forces could secure it completely. What they found confirmed the impossible. Grenade fragment patterns showed 8 distinct detonation points. Shell casings from a Kar 98K rifle matched the final kills. Boot prints in the mud told the story of a single man moving through the carnage with terrifying precision. The investigation report used a phrase that would appear in German military documents for weeks afterward. Einzelkämpfer mit außergewöhnlicher Gefährlichkeit. A single combatant of extraordinary danger. But Vogel saw something else in this report. Something that worried him far more than one dangerous Canadian. He saw a pattern. Canadian soldiers had earned a fearsome reputation throughout the war. They fought with an aggression that German commanders found unsettling. They did not retreat when logic demanded retreat. They did not surrender when surrender was the sensible option. And now this. A man who turned his own capture into a massacre. Vogel drafted a memorandum that went directly to Army Group H headquarters. His recommendation was chilling in its implications. All German units should treat Canadian prisoners as potentially armed, even after search procedures. Any Canadian who surrendered should be considered dangerous until secured in a proper detention facility. And most importantly, German soldiers should not cluster together when accepting surrenders. Spread out. Maintain firing positions. Never assume a surrendering enemy is truly defeated. These orders reached frontline German units within days. Some commanders went even further. There are documented cases of German officers ordering that Canadian prisoners be searched twice before being moved to rear areas. Some units began the practice of forcing Canadian prisoners to strip to their undergarments immediately upon capture. The Laughing Devil had changed how Germans treated every Canadian soldier they encountered. But the impact went beyond just prisoner handling procedures. German morale in the Rhine sector took a measurable hit. Soldiers who had been fighting doggedly against overwhelming odds began to question whether any victory was possible against an enemy that produced men like the Laughing Devil. A captured German diary from late March 1945 contained an entry that perfectly captured this psychological effect. The writer was a 19-year-old private named Kurt Brenner. He wrote about hearing the farmhouse story from a wounded soldier evacuated from the front. The Canadian laughed at them before killing 42 men. What kind of people are we fighting? They do not surrender. They do not die. They just keep coming and laughing. I am beginning to think we cannot win against such enemies. This diary was later found on Brenner's body after he was killed in an Allied air raid. He never saw the end of the war. German commanders noticed this morale problem and tried to counter it with propaganda. Official communications described the farmhouse incident as an act of treachery that violated the laws of war. They called Tommy a war criminal who had abused the sacred tradition of surrender. But this propaganda backfired badly. Instead of making German soldiers angry, it made them afraid. If the Canadians had soldiers willing to fake surrender and kill 42 men, what else were they capable of? But the German reaction was not the only challenge Tommy faced in the weeks after the farmhouse. Within his own regiment, uncomfortable questions were being asked. The fake surrender tactic that had saved Tommy's life and killed 42 Germans occupied a murky space in the laws of war. The Geneva Convention protected soldiers who surrendered in good faith. But what about soldiers who pretended to surrender as a combat tactic? Was that a legitimate ruse of war, or was it perfidy, a war crime that could result in prosecution? Tommy's company commander, Captain Morrison, had recommended him for the Victoria Cross. But when that recommendation reached brigade headquarters, it triggered an immediate review. Legal officers were consulted. The Judge Advocate General's office in London was asked for an opinion. For 3 agonizing weeks, Tommy existed in a strange limbo. He was simultaneously being considered for the highest military honor and potentially being investigated for war crimes. The strain showed on his face. He stopped telling jokes. He stopped laughing. The other men in his section noticed the change and worried about him. Sergeant Fraser pulled Tommy aside one evening and told him something that helped. Whatever those lawyers decide does not change what happened. You saved our lives. Every man in this section went home to their families because of what you did. The rest is just paperwork. The legal review eventually concluded in Tommy's favor. The key factor was the specific circumstances of his situation. Tommy had not planned the fake surrender in advance. He had not set out to abuse the protection of the white flag. He had been genuinely trapped with no other option for survival. His fake surrender was a desperate improvisation, not a calculated deception. More importantly, he had never actually said the words, "I surrender," or displayed any formal sign of capitulation. He had simply raised his hands in what the Germans interpreted as surrender. The distinction was legally crucial. The Victoria Cross recommendation was downgraded to a military medal, partly because of these legal ambiguities, and partly because the full details of the action could not be made public during wartime. German propaganda was already calling Tommy a war criminal. Giving him the VC would only amplify that narrative. Tommy accepted the lesser medal without complaint. He told Fraser he would rather have the boys back than any medal. But the legal uncertainty had lasting effects. Canadian military training materials were updated to address the ethical complexities of surrender deception. The Tommy Higgins case became a study in military law courses for decades afterward. April 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final desperate weeks. German resistance was collapsing across all fronts. But collapsing does not mean surrendering. The fighting around the Rhine and into northern Germany remained brutal and bloody. Every village could be a fortress. Every bridge could be booby-trapped. Every retreating German unit could turn and fight at any moment. Tommy's regiment pushed forward through this chaos, part of the massive Allied advance that was crushing the Third Reich from all directions. On April 12, 1945, the Regina Rifles received orders to clear a series of villages along the Ems River. Intelligence suggested light resistance. Intelligence was wrong again. The village of Meppen had been turned into a strongpoint by a mixed force of Wehrmacht regulars and Waffen-SS fanatics. Approximately 200 German soldiers had fortified the town center with machine gun positions, anti-tank obstacles, and pre-positioned artillery. They had orders to hold at all costs, to delay the Allied advance for as long as humanly possible. Every hour they held was another hour for German civilians to flee east, away from the advancing armies. Tommy's company approached Meppen from the southwest at dawn. The morning fog hung thick over the flat terrain, limiting visibility to maybe 30 meters. They could hear German voices ahead, but could not see the defensive positions. The lead platoon moved cautiously through a farm field when the first machine gun opened fire. Then a second, then a third. Within seconds, the entire company was pinned down in the open, with no cover and no clear understanding of enemy positions. Men died in those first terrible moments. Medics crawled through the mud, trying to reach the wounded, while bullets cracked overhead. The company commander called for artillery support, but the fog made accurate fire impossible. They were stuck, bleeding, dying. Tommy was near the rear of the formation when the ambush began. He immediately started moving forward, crawling through drainage ditches and behind low stone walls. Other soldiers saw him moving and thought he was insane. Where was he going? What could one man do against fortified positions? Tommy reached a position about 50 meters from the nearest German machine gun nest. He could see the muzzle flashes through the fog. He could hear the German gunners shouting to each other. He counted his grenades. 6 this time. He had learned to always carry extra after the farmhouse. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, but changed the entire battle. Tommy worked his way around the German flank, using the fog as cover. He moved like a ghost through the gray mist, silent, patient, deadly. When he was within throwing range of the first machine gun position, he did not hesitate. First grenade. Explosion. Screaming. The machine gun went silent. Tommy was already moving. Second grenade toward a second position he had spotted through the smoke. Another explosion. Another gun silenced. German soldiers started shouting in confusion. Where was the attack coming from? How many Canadians had flanked them? Tommy threw his third grenade into a group of Germans who had left their position to investigate the explosions. 4 men went down. The German defensive line was collapsing from the inside. Panic spread faster than the fog could contain it. German soldiers began abandoning their positions, running toward the village center, running away from the invisible enemy who was killing them one position at a time. Tommy's company commander saw the chaos and seized the moment. He ordered a general advance. The entire company surged forward through the gaps Tommy had created. They poured into the German positions before the defenders could reorganize. The battle for Meppen lasted 6 more hours. House-to-house fighting, room to room, grenades through windows, rifle fire around corners. The Waffen-SS soldiers fought fanatically until the last man. But Tommy's initial assault had broken the defensive line's coherence. Instead of facing a coordinated defense, the Canadians faced isolated pockets of resistance that could be reduced one at a time. By nightfall, Meppen was secured. 112 German soldiers were dead. 63 more had been captured. 15 Canadians had been killed in the assault. Another 22 were wounded. Without Tommy's flanking attack, those numbers would have been much worse. Military analysts later estimated that a frontal assault against the intact defensive line would have cost the company at least 50 dead and possibly forced a retreat. Tommy had saved dozens of Canadian lives with those 6 grenades and 2 minutes of terrifying solo combat. His sergeant found him after the battle sitting alone against a wall. His hands were shaking. His uniform was covered in blood and mud. Fraser sat down beside him without saying anything. After a long silence, Tommy spoke. "I keep thinking about the men I killed today. They were somebody's sons, somebody's husbands, somebody's fathers." Fraser nodded slowly. "So were the Canadians they would have killed if you had not stopped them." Tommy did not respond. He just stared at the ground until someone brought him food and water. Word of the Meppen assault spread through the Canadian forces rapidly. Combined with the farmhouse legend, Tommy Higgins became something more than just a soldier. He became a symbol. Other units requested that he be attached to them for difficult operations. His regiment's morale soared because they had the Laughing Devil on their side. German prisoners captured in the following weeks sometimes asked if they were being held by the unit with the grenade demon. The psychological impact was measurable. Intelligence officers noted that German units facing the Regina rifles showed signs of reduced combat effectiveness. They surrendered more quickly. They abandoned positions more readily. They avoided close combat whenever possible. The legend of one man was affecting the behavior of thousands. Military historians would later calculate that Tommy's actions across the final weeks of the European War, directly or indirectly, saved over 200 Allied lives. His single-handed disruption of German defensive lines at Meppen. His reputation that made German units hesitant to stand and fight. His example that inspired other Canadian soldiers to take aggressive action. All of it combined into a force multiplier that extended far beyond what one private with a rifle and grenades should have been able to accomplish. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Tommy Higgins had survived from D-Day to VE Day. 9 months of continuous combat. Hundreds of firefights. Thousands of artillery shells. Millions of bullets. And he was still alive. Still whole, still carrying the weight of everything he had done and everything he had seen. But the war had one more chapter for Tommy, one more experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Something that had nothing to do with combat or killing or survival. In late April, just days before the German surrender, Tommy's unit helped liberate a place that defied human comprehension. A place where the true evil of the Nazi regime was laid bare for all to see. In Part 4, we will witness what Tommy found in that camp. We will see how a man who had laughed in the face of death finally broke down and wept. We will learn what happened to the Laughing Devil after the guns fell silent. And we will discover the secret Tommy carried to his grave. A secret that explains everything about who he really was. The killing was over. But the hardest part of Tommy's story was just beginning. In Part 1, we met Private Thomas Higgins, a Saskatchewan farm boy who faked his own surrender to 42 German paratroopers near the Rhine River. In Part 2, we watched him pull 8 grenades from beneath his jacket and kill every single one of those Germans in just 24 seconds. The Laughing Devil earned his name that day. In Part 3, we saw how his legend spread through both Allied and German forces, changing how the enemy treated Canadian prisoners and inspiring his own comrades to fight harder. We witnessed his devastating assault at Meppen, where 6 grenades broke an entire German defensive line. By May 1945, Tommy Higgins had become more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol of Canadian fighting spirit. But symbols are not the same as men. Men carry wounds that do not show on the surface. Men remember things they wish they could forget. And men eventually have to go home and try to live normal lives after doing extraordinary things. This final chapter contains a twist that changes everything you thought you knew about the Laughing Devil. Because the hardest battle Tommy ever fought was not in Germany. It was inside his own mind for the next 53 years. Late April 1945. The German Reich was collapsing hour by hour. Tommy's regiment pushed deeper into northern Germany as resistance crumbled. On April 27th, they received orders to investigate a facility near the town of Sandbostel. Intelligence reports described it as a prisoner of war camp. The reports were incomplete. What Tommy found there would haunt him until his dying day. The smell hit them first. A mile away from the camp, a stench unlike anything Tommy had ever experienced began seeping into the air. Sweet and rotten and utterly wrong. Some soldiers vomited before they even reached the gates. When they finally entered, they found hell on earth. Sandbostel was not just a POW camp. It had become a death camp in the final months of the war. Thousands of prisoners from evacuated concentration camps further east had been crammed into facilities designed for a fraction of that number. They had been left to die of starvation, disease, and exposure. Corpses lay everywhere, stacked like cordwood against walls, piled in ditches, left where they had fallen in the mud. And among the dead walked the living. Skeletal figures in striped rags who stared at the Canadian soldiers with eyes that had seen too much suffering to comprehend that salvation had finally arrived. Tommy, the man who had laughed in the face of 42 German guns, broke down completely. Witnesses said he walked through the camp in a daze, tears streaming down his face, his rifle hanging forgotten at his side. He found a group of child survivors huddled in a corner of a barracks. Children who should have been playing and laughing and dreaming about their futures. Instead, they were barely alive, too weak to stand, too traumatized to speak. Tommy sat with them for hours. He gave them his rations. He wrapped them in his own jacket. He held them while they cried. And he cried with them. Sergeant Fraser found him there as night fell. Fraser had never seen Tommy cry before. Not when friends died. Not when he was wounded. Not during the worst of the fighting. But here among these children, the laughing devil wept like a broken man. Fraser later wrote in his diary that he knew then that the Tommy they had known was gone forever. Something had shattered inside him that would never fully heal. The liberation of Sandbostel changed Tommy in ways that even 42 dead Germans had not. He stopped laughing entirely. The dark humor that had kept him sane through 9 months of combat disappeared. He became quiet and withdrawn. The other soldiers worried about him, but did not know what to say. Tommy received his military medal in a ceremony in June 1945. The commanding officer pinned the ribbon to his chest. Tommy stood at attention, but his eyes were far away. When the officer stepped back and saluted Tommy, said quietly that he would rather have the boys back who did not make it. The officer himself, a veteran of both World Wars, replied that they would rather he be here to remember them. Tommy nodded and said nothing more. He returned to Saskatchewan in late 1945 on a troop ship packed with soldiers heading home. He married his childhood sweetheart Ruth in early 1946. She had waited for him through 3.5 years of war, writing letters every week, even when months passed without reply. They bought a small farm outside Regina and raised 4 children together. Tommy worked the land just as his father had before him. Waking before dawn. Working until dark. Finding some measure of peace in the simple rhythm of farming life. But the war never truly left him. Ruth told their children years later that Tommy would sometimes wake screaming in the night. He would sit on the edge of the bed shaking and sweating. She learned not to ask what he had dreamed. She learned to simply hold him until the trembling stopped. But the real legacy of Tommy Higgins was not the nightmares or the medals or the stories told in regimental reunions. It was something far more important that affected military thinking for generations to come. The farmhouse incident and the Meppen assault were studied extensively by military analysts after the war. They wanted to understand how one soldier could have such outsized impact on battlefield outcomes. What they discovered led to significant changes in how armies trained their infantry. The key insight was grenade doctrine. Before World War II, grenades were considered secondary weapons. Soldiers carried them, but were trained to rely primarily on their rifles. Tommy's actions demonstrated that in close combat grenades could be far more decisive than rifle fire. A single soldier with multiple grenades could suppress or destroy enemy positions that would otherwise require an entire squad with supporting fire. Canadian military training was updated to emphasize aggressive grenade use in close quarters. Soldiers were encouraged to carry more grenades than the standard two. Training exercises included scenarios where soldiers practiced rapid sequential grenade deployment. The Tommy Higgins case became a standard teaching example at Canadian Forces combat training centers. But the influence spread far beyond Canada. British forces adopted similar training modifications. American military observers who studied Canadian tactics in the Rhine campaign noted the effectiveness of grenade saturation attacks. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, grenade doctrine had evolved significantly. Infantry units carried heavier grenade loads. Training emphasized throwing accuracy and rapid deployment. The close quarters fighting in Korean villages and hill positions proved the value of these changes. Casualty rates in building clearance operations dropped measurably compared to World War II averages. Vietnam brought another evolution. The dense jungle terrain made grenades even more valuable. American forces developed new grenade types and carrying systems based partly on lessons learned from cases like Tommy's. The M79 grenade launcher, which entered service in 1961, was designed specifically to give individual soldiers more explosive capability at short range. Modern infantry tactics still reflect Tommy's influence. Every soldier in NATO forces today carries fragmentation grenades as standard equipment. Training emphasizes aggressive use of grenades in close combat. The principle that one soldier with sufficient explosive capability can disrupt numerically superior forces is now foundational doctrine. Military historians estimate that the tactical innovations inspired by cases like Tommy's farmhouse action have saved tens of thousands of lives over the following decades. Better grenade doctrine means faster building clearance. Faster building clearance means less time exposed to enemy fire. Less exposure means fewer casualties. The mathematics of combat favor soldiers who can project explosive force rapidly and accurately. But what does Tommy's story teach us beyond military tactics? The deeper lessons speak to something universal about human nature and institutional resistance to change. Tommy did not invent the grenade. He did not discover some secret technology. He simply used existing tools in a way that maximized their effectiveness under desperate circumstances. The lesson is that innovation often comes not from invention, but from application. From seeing possibilities that others miss. From refusing to accept that something cannot work simply because nobody has tried it before. The institutional resistance Tommy faced after the farmhouse incident mirrors patterns we see everywhere. The legal review that questioned whether his actions were legitimate, the downgrading of his medal recommendation due to political concerns, the discomfort of commanders who did not know how to classify what he had done. Institutions protect themselves by standardizing procedures and discouraging deviation. This protects against chaos, but also prevents adaptation. The soldiers and commanders who embrace unconventional approaches often face pushback from their own organizations. History is full of examples parallel to Tommy's story. Colonel John Boyd, who developed the OODA loop theory that revolutionized air combat doctrine, was considered a troublemaker by the U.S. Air Force establishment. Billy Mitchell, who demonstrated the power of air power against naval vessels, was court-martialed for his advocacy. Innovators who challenge established thinking frequently pay personal costs, even when their ideas prove correct. The courage required to try something untested may be greater than the courage required to face enemy fire. Bullets are immediate and external. Institutional rejection is slow and personal. Tommy faced both and survived both. His willingness to act when action seemed impossible to try something different, when conventional approaches had failed, represents a kind of moral courage that transcends military context. In business, in science, In every field of human endeavor, there are Tommy Higgins moments. Situations where the standard approach is failing, and someone must have the courage to try something that everyone else thinks is crazy. The people who change the world are often those who refuse to accept that change is impossible. They are the ones who see opportunity in desperation, who find weapons that others overlook, who laugh in the face of overwhelming odds, because laughter is the only alternative to surrender. And there is one final detail about Tommy Higgins that almost nobody knows. A secret that explains so much about who he was and why he did what he did. In 1982, a military historian tracked down Tommy for an interview about the farmhouse incident. It was the first time Tommy had spoken about that day in detail since 1945. During the interview, Tommy revealed something he had never told anyone except Ruth. His younger brother Michael had been captured by German forces during the Italian campaign in 1943. Michael was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. In early 1945, as Allied forces advanced, the Germans began evacuating POW camps. Michael was forced on a death march through the frozen German countryside. He died of exposure and exhaustion just 3 weeks before the war ended. Tommy did not learn of Michael's death until after VE Day, but he had known since late 1944 that Michael was a prisoner somewhere in Germany. Every German soldier Tommy killed, every position he destroyed, every mile he helped advance, was one step closer to potentially saving his brother. The farmhouse incident happened just 2 weeks after Tommy received the news about Michael. Knowing this changes everything about that eerie smile Tommy wore when he raised his hands in fake surrender. It was not confidence. It was not courage. It was rage. Cold, calculated, devastating rage against the army that had taken his brother. The laughing devil was not laughing at death. He was laughing at the men who had killed someone he loved. And he was about to make them pay. Tommy never spoke publicly about Michael. He never connected his brother's death to his actions at the farmhouse. But Ruth always believed that losing Michael broke something in Tommy and rebuilt it into something harder. Something capable of killing 42 men in 24 seconds without hesitation. Something that could function in hell, because hell had already taken everything that mattered. Tommy Higgins died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary in the Regina newspaper mentioned his war service in a single line. Thomas served with the Canadian Army in World War II. Most people who read that line had no idea what it meant. They did not know about the farmhouse or Meppen or Sandbostel. They did not know about Michael or the nightmares or the 53 years of silent suffering. They saw an old farmer who had lived a quiet life. They did not see the laughing devil. From a Saskatchewan farm boy with 8 grenades hidden under his jacket to a legend that changed how armies trained their soldiers for generations. Tommy Higgins proved that one person in one desperate moment can change everything. He killed 42 enemy soldiers in 24 seconds. He inspired tactical doctrines that have saved thousands of lives. He showed that surrender is never the only option, even when surrender seems inevitable. And he carried the weight of what he did with quiet dignity until the day he died. The final words belong to Tommy himself from that 1982 interview. The historian asked him what he wanted people to remember about the war. Tommy thought for a long moment before answering. Remember that we were just ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. We were not heroes. We were farmers and clerks and factory workers who learned to kill because the world required it. If you want to honor us, do not build monuments. Build a world where boys do not have to learn what we learned. That is the only memorial that matters. If you know another story like this, a forgotten hero who changed the course of history, share it in the comments below. These stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to discover more hidden chapters of military history that shaped the world we live in today. Because history is not made by nations or armies. History is made by ordinary people who refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. And sometimes history is made in just 24 seconds.